Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of making a distinction between free will and determinism and how free will and determinism can exist, and it's just based on a point of view, how free will is most about our point of view and how we're viewing reality, and how determinism is how the reality that we're living in is working and working regardless of the perceptions we have based on the environment and all these kinds of things, based on the movement that's going to predeterministically happen from a beginning to an end, and how all this thing everything that's happening from the beginning caused that caused everything to start happening, the initial cause, an initial cause that existed, and we're just living in the constant interactions, we're in the constant effect, the moving effect, this movement that we describe with time, cause and effect, which is a word synonymous with time. And how we're just constantly moving, how cause and effect in and of itself is an illusion, but it's something that's within the nature and the boundaries of this existence that we're living in. The first cause and effect, and that can be applied in reality because the first cause was the cause, and the effect is the constant movement leading to an end. So yes, free will is a perceptual thing that we're experiencing. We obviously, moving forward, free will is something about something that we're doing. We obviously understand all the things that led up to a certain point. We can see where certain things came from, and we understand that all the things that happened before led to us where we are now, and how it can have only happened one way. Looking back, it happened one way, and there's nothing we can do about the one way that it happened. We can't. There's this idea of time travel and stuff like that. There's no time. Time is just movement, and this movement idea is just something that's leading from one thing to another. We're moving in a constant stream. There's no interaction. There's no irreducible. There's nothing that's spontaneous or irreducible. It can be reduced to a certain amount, sort of like photons, and how things are just moving at the speed of light, and all these things are within boundaries that cause things that are obviously being affected by outside forces and inside forces based on the whole mechanism moving at once. So free will is something that we're perceiving. We're perceiving moving forward. We have free will. We know that even if we're tied up in a box or whatever it may be, the deterministic, almost in a way, is usually connotated and described and understood as something's determined, so you have no control over it. So you're just sort of sitting here. You have no control. Okay. So the dinner's going to make itself. I can't have thoughts. I can't do anything, even though I am. And dinner's not going to make itself, or my breakfast isn't going to make itself unless it was determined to happen. So I can just sit here and let it determinedly happen. I can just sit here, not take any action, and make my bowl of cereal, and the bowl of cereal will just magically, spontaneously appear. So free will and determinism. Determinism is often associated with the idea of spontaneity and how things just spontaneously happen. Things are just going to work out in the end. If someone read the crystal ball and said that you were going to win the war, this theoretical crystal ball, and said you were going to win the battle or the war, and you just sat back and said we're going to win the battle or war, that's what we heard. But it was just self-fulfilling kind of prophecy kind of stuff, where you can only do it if you actually make the action, if you actually take action. If you just sit back and don't do anything, and it said you're going to win the war, it didn't mean you're going to win the war just by sitting back. But the idea, it's a hypothetical situation where it's almost a trickery. It's used in trickery. It's like a trickery, used as trickery and describing a situation, how an outcome's going to happen. So the outcome's going to happen. Obviously that couldn't happen, but obviously the thing that's going to lead up to you winning the battle or war isn't sitting back and doing nothing. It's going to be, from our point of view and understanding the reality that we're living in, obviously based on a hypothetical situation, you're going to have to take action. Something's going to happen to force you to take action. If the theoretical crystal ball can exist, something's going to force you, and you just thinking you can sit back, something's going to call into action and make you fulfill that kind of duty, or that kind of thing where it's going to inevitably lead to an outcome of you winning. You're not just going to sit back and expect that to happen unless that was determined to happen, which isn't the case, and considering this kind of hypothetical situation. But I didn't get really anywhere with that. But free will is a idea where you're moving forward constantly. And you obviously have free will, and you're doing things. You can still move. You obviously, from a perception, your own perception, we can see that we have free will. We're moving forward. We can do things. We can have movement. We move inside of things based on some kind of boundary that we're in, and that's what I mean by these determinism is often associated with boundary things. Boundaries are things working on their own, beyond your own, almost separating your thoughts and your projections and understandings from this idea. But all this stuff is working in one, and these cause and effects and the thoughts that you have now are based on the previous causes and effects that have led up to the moment in time, and your thoughts and and your projections are not distinct from the reality happening. Sort of like the bowl of cereal has to be made by you actually moving and having the thought of making the cereal, and so on and so forth. With the action, the idea of it making the cereal, the cereal is not just going to magically appear in front of you and serve itself to you. You're going to do that yourself. So free will is a perceptual thing. From our point of view, we can move forward and have free will. Determinism, the idea of determinism, obviously, is something and consequence and circumstance. People like this moral culpability or ethics and culpability, taking responsibility for your actions. It's not about making that distinction. It's about making the distinction that you're going to have responsibility. There are going to be consequences. The best way to look at it is consequences and circumstances. And just because circumstances control who you are doesn't mean within the game that we're playing that there aren't consequences for that action. There's not going to be some cause and effect and interaction that's going to cause a certain thing from happening. And that goes back to the unfairness thing. We're interactions. We're products of our circumstance. Life is unfair. Describing the circumstances and reactions of these sentient beings existing inside this world that we're living in, and the consequence. We live by our circumstance. We do something, say we murder something. The circumstance is that we murdered something, but we're a victim of our circumstance, and that circumstance created the murder. We're not the murderer. We can't take moral culpability, but within the game we're playing, we're still pieces inside the game of this deterministic game that we're playing. We're still moving forward. We're still playing out the role in our game, and obviously based on our own free will, based on our own perception and free will and things like that. We obviously can take responsibility, and we view these things like guilt and such and so forth. We feel these things because we feel responsible and things like that, And regardless of the circumstance, there's going to be consequences for this circumstance, and that goes back to the idea that life is unfair, and that's describing life in general in the deterministic universe of all these interactions. We're just products of circumstances based on these sentient beings interacting and bumping off of each other, and hitting off on all these interactions based on the circumstances and the environment and all sorts of things based on the circumstances, the foundation of their existence and the existence of everything interacting with them. And that goes back to the consequences, the circumstances that you killed the person, and the consequences you're going to go to jail for life, or you're going to be chased down in a manhunt and shot. There's going to be some circumstance leading to some inevitable outcome that's going to lead to a circumstance based, to a consequence based off the circumstance, which is just interaction, moving things together. And that consequence is going to have another interaction, cause another interaction. We're reacting based on these interactions around us, regardless of anything like determinism or free will. So free will is a perceptual thing. It's projection. It's subjective. Based on the idea of free will, implies subjectivity, where we can just apply anything we want. While determinism implies subjectivity based on things are going to happen a certain way, and it closes at the idea that things are going to happen a certain way based on certain facts that really exist in reality that we live in. But free will is distinct from determinism. It can exist in the same way, depending on how you describe free will and determinism. Free will and determinism can exist in the same world. Determinism is just how the whole game works, the existence, reality, describing the reality that we're living in. Free will is describing the particular circumstance and the responsibility, personal responsibility, the circumstances of the individual things that are existing on this planet, are existing in reality, and taking responsibility, feeling all these feelings, the existence, the sentience, understanding. It comes from this idea of sentience and having spatial awareness, self-awareness, and that's where free will comes from, and it's on a more person-by-person basis. It's more on a living, sentient basis that free will can be applied, but free will can be applied to a deterministic understanding of what led up to these circumstances that led from one thing to another and one thing to another, and it can be applied to the reason why free will as a concept can exist and understanding how it applies to us as human beings or sentient creatures, and it's just a perceptual state of mind and understanding how we're interacting with the environment, and how it can apply to things like on a human level or on a sentient level, like personal responsibility, like I mentioned before, and perception and projection, things we want and how we interact. And we're viewing it, and the sentient part, the aware part, can be applied to free will and how we understand the reality and how we perceive things based on the sentience and how it has a effect on how we interact with the world. So determinism consumes the idea of free will because we're existing in a deterministic universe based off cause and effect, which should in and of itself explain the idea well enough. We're living in a circumstantial universe based on interactions and unfair and consequences, which is the interactions, circumstances and consequences, the causes and effects, which is just basic interactions, which is the basis of the unfairness of life that we're living. So just because we have free will moving forward, determinism can only be applied to the past, and determinism can't be applied to you just sitting back and just sitting back and hoping your bowl of cereal is going to create itself. You're going to have to take initiative in making the cereal itself. Just because you want it, based on the determinism is based on what you want. Applying it, misusing the word determinism, doesn't mean you're going to get it unless you take action and you move forward. A bowl of cereal is not going to make itself unless it deterministically happened by circumstance. And that would describe that kind of situation. So hypothetically, the idea of time travel and the crystal ball thing can't be applied because obviously you would change the flow of determinism and recognizing the future. So the deterministic mechanism that was originally existing wasn't based on what you saw in the crystal ball, but based on the reaction that you had to the crystal ball telling you, or the mind reader or the tarot card reader telling you in reaction. So the reaction that you had to the crystal ball and the different interaction between the crystal ball reading and what you actually did is just showing that the crystal ball reading was within the deterministic mechanism of this universe, of this reality that we're living in, and that the crystal ball was nothing more than a farce to get you to believe something, to feel like you had sort of like thinking that you're going to win the war battle, when in reality sitting back and there's a war going on. Sitting back and them telling you you're going to win the war doesn't mean you're going to win the war. You're going to have to take responsibility and do something. But obviously that winning the war with the crystal ball, telling you, wouldn't prove determinism. Wouldn't. No, I'm getting lost in the analogy because there's so many points. But it doesn't mean that the idea that you're reading the crystal ball in this hypothetical situation wouldn't work, because obviously something different would happen in the outcome in the crystal ball reading, and the things and the way you reacted and what you expected to happen was just part of the deterministic mechanism to begin with, and that was what's going to happen. And the end outcome is obviously looking back and seeing what was going to happen anyway. So that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen anyway. You look back, and determinism is nothing more than an idea you can live by, and something you could look back at and saying that's what happened. That's how it existed. That's what's going to happen. And looking forward, we can assume the idea of free will and understand that we still take responsibility for our actions, because we're still within this game that we're playing. We're still playing our part. We're still playing the living creature, taking responsibility for his actions, doing things, and there's going to be reactions and consequences and circumstances that lead you to do something, say like murder someone, and just because you can't take responsibility for it because it's a deterministic universe. Well, obviously it's a deterministic universe based off cause and effect, but doesn't mean there's not going to be consequences for the actions that you take by being in the circumstances, based on the unfairness and the interactions around you that create the life that you're being a part of. So it doesn't matter. There's circumstances and consequences, but that's why life is unfair, the unfair game. Everything's unfair. Everything's just interactions, creating all this unevenness based on unevenness, and from our point of view, chaos. On the individual point of view, where we understand there's no equal and opposite reaction just because determinism happens. Things just happen. There's not a right amount of death. There's not a right amount of suffering. Things are just going to happen a certain way, and just because it's going to happen a certain way doesn't mean there's an equilibrium. That everything that happens is based on everything that happens is an equilibrium. It was meant to happen, it was going to happen, but that doesn't mean you can't apply equilibrium to a completely and utterly different concept, to something like determinism. That kind of concept can't be applied to determinism because it's completely outside the boundaries of understanding things that are just going to happen, and applying some kind of equilibrium, how things are just going to balance out in the end, is a complete moot point when it comes to the idea that something's going to happen. And it's not based on a mechanism of things working out in the end. It's not built upon a mechanism of things just working out in the end. And I think based on a personal level, all of us can understand that that's not necessarily the case, sort of like the equal and opposite reaction. You're not always going to feel satisfied in the end based on, it can only be almost in a way applied to our individual circumstances, and understanding cause and effect, and realizing I do this and this has a cause and I have an effect on the, or the idea that I do something but I get something less out of it. We obviously know that we're unsatisfied sometimes, and that it can only be applied to some kind of idea of satiation, and feeling like you're getting some kind of equal compensation reaction to the work that you did for something, or the suffering or deprivation that you went through for something. So the idea of equilibrium is a complete moot point when it comes to the idea of something being deterministic, because it doesn't matter. Something's going to happen no matter what. Moving forward in the piece, in the game that we're playing, it helps create the moot point that this idea of equilibrium doesn't exist in the reality that we're living in. The equilibrium is a complete, obviously something's going to happen, but equilibrium, that doesn't mean equilibrium. Equilibrium can only be applied on a different level. I haven't really thought about that whole concept entirely, but it can't be applied to this deterministic universe, because the idea of suffering, all the components that are part of this, the suffering and all that sorts of things, are a byproduct of the existence of the universe. And just because something you want to consider something an equal and opposite reaction doesn't mean it actually is. And I think on a personal scale we can understand that. On a smaller scale, and understanding how things work and we react and so on and so forth. So there's consequences and circumstances, and that gives us the illusion that maybe we can use the semantics in understanding free will and say that we can't take culpability for our actions and ethics and things like that. And we will, but these based on these consequences and circumstances that lead up to a consequence in these interactions that we have, and that leads to the unfairness of life and so on and so forth. There's just going to be consequences and circumstances. The circumstances can based on the circumstances can be unfair, leading to a consequence, which leads you, say, to being a murderer, which was based on your parents' abuse of you or whatever it may be. It wasn't you. You're a victim of your circumstance. It's unfair, leading to an outcome that's going to lead to you being put in prison or something, unless the idea of law became diluted and started implying that since there's no free will, we can't take responsibility for our actions unless a deluded person decided to take control of the law and say that that was somehow true, confusing the whole two concepts up and creating some kind of confusion between the two concepts. But I think they can exist in one, where from our point of view we have free will, we can do things, we're still existing, we're still doing, we're playing out our game based on our own understanding of free will and moving forward and doing what we can do within the circumstances that present themselves. But we can also understand that everything is deterministic and something's going to turn out a certain way, and determinism can only be applied looking back, and it can't be applied looking forward. We can just say that something's going to inevitably happen based on previous events that happened, based on cause and effect in these previous interactions that happened, leading up to a point where I'm now and leading into the future. This constant movement now is in the future, and future where I'm leading to now is going to be something in the past, and then the past is going to be something, and then where I'm now is going to lead into a future where I'm constantly going and going and going. There's only past and present, and we're constantly moving forward into some kind of idea. We're constantly moving forward. So we're constantly moving forward, and there's determinism can only be applied to the past, and saying that we obviously saw something and knew something was going to happen a certain way, and something's going to happen a certain way, and something's going to happen, but based on our own free will, we still play our role in the game that we're playing moving forward. And it's just a perceptual thing that we're experiencing when we understand the concept of free will. Anyway, so I think I made my points good enough. I think I confused a lot of concepts. I didn't do the analogy the best I could have about the whole crystal ball and things like that. But the whole concept of time travel and crystal ball reading and things like that is only a part of the deterministic universe that we live in. It can't be applied to the deterministic universe, because it can be applied. You can fool someone, you can read tarot cards, but still the reaction that you have is just part of the deterministic mechanism based on the falsehood of the idea of reading some kind of crystal ball or something like that. Or the idea of reading a crystal ball wouldn't happen, because based on the idea of determinism and understanding something's going to happen a certain way, if you see that proves determinism in and of itself, I think. And if you see a crystal ball, if someone reads your future, you can decide to change the future. And obviously, if you decide to change the future, it wouldn't have been determined to begin with, and something inevitably happened to begin with, and that inevitable happening was the deterministic universe that you can look back on and saying that's what happened, and that's what was going to happen anyway, and your breakfast isn't going to make itself. If someone told you you're going to have breakfast and you didn't have to make the breakfast, they were lying. You have to make your breakfast to have breakfast. Your breakfast isn't going to magically appear. So based on, it's sort of like winning the war. You're not going to win the war unless you take action. You can't just sit back unless the circumstances deem it so, and you end up getting lucky and saying, okay, well, I sat back and they ended up destroying themselves or whatever it may be. So the concept can't necessarily be applied. The idea of these hypothetical circumstances can't be applied to an idea of deterministic mechanism working the way it is working, based on these mechanical processes that are working, leading from the past to the present and all these interactions that are happening. So I think I've made my point good enough. I don't want to keep babbling. So I think I made my point clear enough. So thank you, and until next time, bye.